Greetings all, Raphael X here with another video. Dr. Raphael X, gotta get used to that. Here with another video with my friend Jeremy to talk philosophical topics here. Today we will talk about the relationship between, well, science and religion, but more specifically we want to address scientism, which is an ideology of science. Definitely a radical view towards science, and see how that relates to religion. Is it a type of religion? Is it open to religion? Is there a harmony between science and religion, like the classical, scholastic, Thomistic approach? Really, that was a great work of St. Thomas, which was to harmonize faith and reason, ultimately science and religion. So we're going to address scientism, but first we have to definitely define our terms. And yeah, let me ask Jeremy, if you want to kind of chime in here and yeah, let us know what you what is your view here.
Defining terms is probably a very good idea with a conversation such as this, or any conversation. Can start with science, right? By science could be meant whatever we wish to mean by the term in principle, as with any other term, right? I can mean by the word table, a table, or that could be somebody's name, or it could be my pet hamster's name, whatever it might be. So we want to think about what it is that we mean by the term science. One such meaning could describe or attempts to understand, observe, classify the phenomenal world, meaning content such as arises in connection with the senses, and to find increasingly efficient ways of dealing with it so as to further our practical ends. For example, technology, right? We can make measurements and understand some of the dynamics governing the sensible world, right? Again, sense-connected content, such as concerns aerodynamics, for example, which can enable us to build planes, such as concern different interactions of substances, such as can permit is done in chemistry and such. So that would be one sense of the term science. Another sense of the term science that I think you may have been alluding to would be a set of statements or claims that arise in any given milieu as to the fundamental nature of reality, right? And then an adherence to those claims, and a proposition that they are factually and fundamentally correct. So, for example, science in the first sense of the term could be used and was used efficiently and effectively in, say, ancient Roman times to build their fine roads and aqueducts and bridges and such. And try to build a bridge without any scientific understanding, at least one that's not made out of paper and scotch tape or something, and it's going to be tough. So we have to understand a lot of things about the world to build a bridge. That will be the first sense of the term. The second sense of the term would be, for example, some number of centuries, whatever it was, where, say, the Aristotelian physics was in ascendancy, and it was an absolute dogma that, or an absolute fact that the earth is still and the universe revolves around the earth, right? And that would be the second sense of the term science. Chime in.
Yeah, no, for sure. Science now, interestingly, what you alluded to, I mean, the classical notion of science was much broader than the modern term of science, which is very reductionist, we can say, to meaning something merely experimental, something you do in a lab, or something that just has a practical purpose. Science in the classical sense was something you wanted to know for the sake of knowing. It wasn't purely for practical means. Like, science is more and more reductive as technology advances. We see science as kind of something that, a tool that helps us live better through technology, essentially, and how we can know things. But really, classically, again, it is more knowing for its own sake, and is broader, right? Science, and there's a whole different method, right? The scientific methods, um, which come later, right? With deduction, as you mentioned, through the senses. Then we have experimentation. But really, when we hypothesize in science, it's really philosophical. So this is interesting how science is born from philosophy. Science and philosophy classically are indistinguishable, right? So science, in a very in its true, in its original sense, is really the study of things through their causes, right? And philosophy would be the study of things through their ultimate causes, right? Which is ultimately being metaphysics. But yeah, science looks for the causes of things. So there is an interesting transition with the mythological mindset, and you see this in the school of Miletus, the first philosopher being Thales, 6th century before Christ. That he's really going to make the distinction. He's going to look for natural explanation for phenomena. Like, for example, with the mythological mindset, they would attribute all things to supernatural causes. So the crops would grow, they would say, with the mythological mindset, the gods did it, right? The god of fertility, which is a common one, right? The god of fertility. A lot of these actually human sacrifices were to some type of god of fertility, which, as St. Paul says, right, in Christianity, they were demons. Or the thunder would be the god is angry, right? This mythological kind of mindset of attributing supernatural causes to all phenomena. Now, the transition becomes more of a logos, using the Greek word mindset, where there is natural phenomenon. Yes, we all see that. But instead of attributing it to a supernatural cause, we attribute it to a natural cause. So, for example, like before, they literally believed that there was a God in the center of the earth that would attract things towards himself. Right? That would be a supernatural, a mythological explanation. But with the natural explanation, we ultimately come up with gravity. Obviously, there's a progress in science. But that transition is very interesting. It's the birth of philosophy, which underpins science. And this is very important. Philosophy underpins science because with scientism, which we will go into, it seems like it's going to radically deny that, essentially, and make science a type of absolute form of knowledge. So it's really interesting. So the question is, if the mythological mindset contradicts the logos or the mythos, if it contradicts the logos mindset or view, can we have two types of causes? Is there a contradiction? Are they the same? Can they be compatible? And I think that's interesting, which I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, there's some great points, I think, Professor. We could some scholars have suggested that a good way to think about science would be philosophy that has forgotten or that denies its so-called metaphysical presuppositions. Yeah. Meaning, after we have assumed a number of axioms about the nature of reality, for example, what is space, what is time, what is the relation of the subject to the object, what are objects, can they conceivably subsist of their own accord. We make certain such suppositions, and then we've forgotten that we made them, and we go off of the system that then arises. And it can lead to the funny statements of some scientists that science has defeated philosophy, or that philosophy is irrelevant, right? As I think, say, Richard Feynman famously said, philosophy is just for armchair speculators, while science is the real hard stuff. So on the contrary, it could be offered that, and in connection with your point as to the mythological view of things versus a view such that would try to find objective causes, it could be offered that what we're presented with are what we can call, just to unify them, appearances, right? And then we try to account for these appearances in logical ways. We try to come up with ways to predict appearances, and we build world images, world models, notably using mathematics to describe the appearances and to help predict them. But that on principle, rules out any possibility of ever getting to reality in and of its own self via any closer interface or engagement with the appearances. What does that mean? You can spell it out. So let's say that really good physicists, such as a Feynman or an Einstein or a Planck or somebody like that, falls asleep and has a dream, right? And everything that can be experienced in waking life on principle can be dreamt. While dreaming, the physicist can make measurements, right? Say this is what is a foot, right? Or a yard, this is what is an inch, this is what is a centimeter, whatever the case might be, might take measurements, might describe the dream world, the appearances with math, and then having mathematicize those appearances, right? Further extrapolations and deductions can be had ad infinitum up and until the physicist would say, you know, the real reality of the stuff that I see are little dots, and those little dots are made up out of other little dots with little solar systems inside. Okay, the atomistic hypotheses, and there's all these, black holes and wormholes in the sky, and the universe, and this and that. But we say that whether or not such words would refer to possible experiences of the physicist, that method on principle can never lead him or her to an understanding of reality in any sort of fundamental philosophical conceptual manner.
Yeah,
you get the point?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's definitely it's built upon a metaphysical realism. So science and traditionally it's science does not give you the nature of things, but it just tells you how things behave. So really, for example, physics is really traditionally physics is the study of being as mobile, being as moving, right? And metaphysics is being as immobile, immutable being, and metaphysics as being the underpinning of physics. So yeah, for sure, there's a metaphysical underpinning of science, and the metaphysics. I mean, philosophy justifies the science. Really, you have to affirm first the existence of a world, right? That there are things that exist in themselves that we can know what they are, and that we can know, right, some of their causes. So yeah, when science tries to usurp metaphysics, it tries to essentially it tries to do what it can't, right? It cannot tell me what essentially things are, only in a scientific manner, yes, which is really it's accidental because it refers to the causes of things. Like, for example, we don't really know what gravity is. No, we don't actually. Gravity is still a tremendous mystery, and even with a theory of relativity, Einstein had a model where things almost a denial, essentially a denial of gravity, where things, it's not that gravity makes things fall, but rather things just follow their natural path, which is really fascinating. So, and what is light? It's light, photons. Is light a wave? Right, because it acts like both. It seems like it can't be both, but so really science, it doesn't give us that definitive, but it presupposes that things do exist in themselves, and that essentially is metaphysical realism. But what you're saying also, and this is what the first philosophers slash scientists believed in. The first philosophers were scientists. They were looking for the primary stuff of all things. Like, they literally asked, what makes a thing a thing? Right? Why are we observe, according to the appearances, we observe many things, but somehow, because they're things, they have to be one somehow, and that oneness is in some type of matter. So what is the fundamental matter of all things that is most fundamental and can't be broken up? And that's where you get the atomus. Atom literally means unbreakable. But we know now actually that there are subatomic realities. So we can keep on breaking and breaking. So is there a fundamental matter? And it seems like it is merged with the spirit. I mean, I'm going a little bit, maybe a little far to a little off, but not so much. It's merged with the spirit, like in quantum mechanics, where a lot of these scientists are getting now into metaphysics, where there is no fundamental matter. But going back to the classical the first philosophers slash scientists. I always call them scientists because their philosophy was very much naturalistic, materialistic. They looked for the first things, the primary substance, we can say, the primary stuff of all things, but in a material principle. It had to be a material principle. So Thales said, you know, change is in the appearance, right? That's something we immediately observe, that things change, things move. But there has to be a subject of change. There can't just be change, 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 or appearance, appearance, appearance. There ultimately has to be something that is the subject, and that's the ultimate reality, but is not itself an appearance and is not itself changeable, right? There has to be a subject of the change, and that can't be changeable. It's very logical. So he had good arguments, but then he ultimately got to water being the fundamental matter of all things, right? Some people make fun of him, but again, profound, primitive, right? It's just his first recorded transition from mythos to logos. Plus, we don't have all the works of the schools of Miletus. That's another story why we don't. We know them through Aristotle principally, but really, this whole reasoning is the very birth of, causes the very birth of science, right? That there has to be a first a first material thing, and then hence we get the four elements, which is I think Protagoras' position. Anaximenes or Anaximander, I forget which one, says that air was the fundamental matter. So you're seeing a very much philosophy. You're seeing very much a philosophy and science are born at the same time, meaning that they need each other. Essentially, you cannot have science without philosophy, and really philosophy. Well, you can have a philosophy without science in sense pure deduction, but yes, philosophy would lead to science, right? For our betterment, something practical, something experimental, yeah, as a consequence.
Yeah, yeah, lots of good stuff there. Now, I mean, we can try to examine some of those presuppositions that form the contemporary scientific worldview and try to really understand the earlier point about the, from a philosophical perspective, possibly the impossibility of ever going from appearance to reality by any closer examination of appearance. So perhaps, approaching the question from a psychological point of view, some scholars have suggested that human thought can be broken up into several broad phases. The first such phase, as seen in both individual infants at any historical period and also in so-called primitive cultures and in the childhood of humanity way back, it would be to have no cognizance of anything but independently subsisting objects, which are thought to exist in and of their own self, entirely unrelated to each other. So, for example, I see as again a baby or as whoever I might be, I see a stone and I have no thought whatsoever as to any possible relation between that stone and myself. I have no consciousness of myself per se. It is simply an object, and I can try to understand how it relates to my interest. Maybe I can throw this stone. Maybe I can stub my toe on it or something like this. So this would be the phase of thought from which, say, as you framed it, or as you called it, scientism would flow. It would be supposing objects to exist in and of their own self, of their own accord. And here, then, the following step would be to split up sense content between so-called primary and so-called secondary qualities. Meaning primary qualities would be things like number, things like size, things like length. Those really then exist in reality. After, for example, Descartes suggested that there is a split between the sensible world and the subject, where therefore then something such as color, taste, smell has to exist in the subject, right? And what exists in the object, well, it would have to be, again, length, solidity, textual impenetrability, meaning, we can't move our hand through a table or something like this. So once we've split up our world into these pieces, then it follows to say that all the qualities that make the world beautiful for us and meaningful, again, the beautiful colors of flowers, the sounds of music, at least considered as sounds and not as waves or something like this, smells, the smell of food, whatever it might be. Those are so-called secondary qualities that exist strictly in the subject. Excuse me, and the primary qualities exist out there. Now, those primary qualities then need to be described mathematically, and as we mentioned, a world image can be built up with these philosophical presuppositions, and from there, certain deductions can be made, right? And certain propositions as to future possible experiences can be made. But we see again that we can never, on principle, go from our sense-connected experiences to anything beyond that. If I say, for example, a red square, what is there? There's the color red, there's the shape, right? And it is, as has been suggested no few amount of times, it is absurd to try to truly break that up into so-called primary and secondary qualities, saying that the squareness or something really objectively exists and the red just exists in my mind. It's either all objective or all subjective, we could say, right? And we can never, again, by that method, say, and really the red square is made up out of these hypothetical entities, right? The next phase of thought would be something like a pantheism or an awareness of subjectivity, but here also many problems ensue, and perhaps the highest phase of thought would be to come to a cognizance of oneself as a self-active subject, and from this stage of thought, the reality of other people and the reality of any kind of underlying substratum of appearances can be posited.
Yeah, for
As you
sure.
were talking about.
Yeah, that's very Galileo talks about that too, and John Locke too. There is something interesting about their argument. I mean, one can see why mathematics would be seen as more objective than, for example, or as objective, and that color would be subjective, because there in the secondary qualities you do see disagreements. But in mathematics, there's no room for disagreements, and so in that sense, that's how they argue for, which is interesting. I mean, the Pythagorean position is that really math is, he was more interested in the mystical symbolism of numbers. So, like, yes, two cats will change, but two will never change. And the notion of equality, like we see in the appearances, we do see two equal things, but we do know, and we can prove that there's no two things that are completely equal. Now, where does the notion of perfect equality come from? It's only in mathematics, with it one equals, right, or two equals one plus one, perfect equality. Where mathematics is so black and white that they believe, I mean, it replaces metaphysics, because they see the certainty in the mathematical realm. So and this is where Pythagoras, he's looking for the primary stuff, not in the material things, but in the quantifiable, in the numerical, in numbers, that essentially all things are numbers, right? Now, Thomas Aquinas' position is interesting too, and it goes to what you're saying, that yeah, these are all objective, but it's the way, it's the according to the abstraction of the thing. So, for example, when we see if everything comes from the senses, right? St. Thomas Aquinas is going to follow Aristotle, and again, this is very scientific. But well, some people talk about quantum mechanics maybe being more abstract, or some type of abstract science being besides or prescinding from the senses. But I'm not talking about that now. For what we immediately perceive, at least experimental science, it comes from the senses. So Thomas Aquinas says that there's three levels of abstraction. So you have a thing, you abstract its natural properties, right? It's physical components, it's chemical components. If it's alive, it's biological components, and then the births of the sciences come. Then the second way of abstraction is when you abstract is a more profound way. You abstract the quantity of the thing, and it's mathematics. So Thomas Aquinas is going to admit, in the sense that when we extract mathematics from reality, mathematics existing formally in the mind, but foundationally in reality, it's going to be a deeper penetration, a mental penetration of the thing. Now that's interesting. That's very Aristotelian. Um, Platonic view does talk about, right, kind of numbers existing apart from numbered things. But the last level of abstraction for Thomas Aquinas is metaphysics. When we get to what things are, right there, when we abstract the essence of a thing, right, what that thing is, right, it's the metaphysical, and we get to it as a being, right, as an existing thing. And so from there, we're able to form sciences, metaphysics being the most universal science, but in the second level of abstraction, mathematics. So there is something to, but again, with the scientific revolution, it's very much radical. Where, and this is, we're going to be going into scientism now, because this is where the root of scientism comes from, where mathematics becomes overemphasized, overstressed to the point where it replaces metaphysics. And Thomas Aquinas is like, no. He would say, no. But metaphysics is the first, the most profound level of abstraction of things. Mathematics, we're abstracting an accident, essentially a quantity of things, which again is profound, very objective, yes, black and white, but still it cannot replace being. And this is what happens with the scientism, in a sense. Well, scientism has mathematics and science and the other experimental science replacing metaphysics, and it's ultimately to the demise of science.
Yeah, great point. Let's talk about mathematics a little bit, right? How does math apply so well onto our sense-connected content? How can we use this seemingly purely abstract tool to do such things as send spaceships into space, to figure out how many pages of a text we need to read a day, and then somehow we read it on time? Right, so we can think about the nature of a single numeral. What do we mean by one? You add an apple and an orange. How do you get two? You get an apple and an orange. So how come you add one and you get two? So perhaps it could be offered that by one is meant a single kind of, say, will to conceive of something apart from other things in abstract. And another one would be the same thing. Right? And one by tautology would be one such volition to conceive of something singular, and another such volition to conceive of something singular. And these abstractions can then be synthetically connected and used to denote any given content of sense perception. So for an example, for example, right, I'm at the supermarket and I'm shopping for apples. So I'm thinking, if I put in an apple and an apple into my bag, I will have two apples. Now, by apple, I mean something that for me is a single thing, one apple. And I denote that by the numeral one. And then by the other one, I denote the same thing. Right? And consequently, when I have one apple and one apple, I have two apples. Right? Also, I can replace the apple with an orange. An apple and an orange is not two. It's an apple and an orange, but conceived as a singular, isolated entity. There are two such entities in abstract, and they can refer to, again, any two particular objects, such as an apple and an orange. Right? Let's say that I want to figure out how to finish a 100-page book in 10 days. Excuse me. So, first of all, in abstract, I consider what is 100. One, say, volition, to view something as singular, another one, and so forth, till we reach 100. And same thing for 10. Now I think, how many groupings of 10 do I need to fit in to each day? Right, we're dividing, and we have 10 days and we have 100 pages, right? So I divide 100 by 10. How many pages do I need to read a day? So there's 10 groups of 10. So therefore, if I read 10 pages each day, for 10 days, I will have finished the book. But then how does that apply to real life? Well, because I then have to define what is for me a day and what is for me a page. And insofar as I have um, made such definitions, right, then however I have defined the matter, I will have finished 100 pages in 10 days. I could, in principle, define a day from sunrise to sunset. I could define it as a study session for 3 hours. I could define it any which way. I could call a page, there's different size pages, something very big, a scroll or something like that, a little page, whatever it might be. But basically, I've synthetically connected my abstract reasoning to concrete realities, and that is why they can be used to describe those realities and to predict them. So again, I can predict ahead of time how many days I'm going to need in order to finish 100 pages in my head and abstract them. Then by applying it correctly, that can actually occur in real life. So likewise, presumably with everything else, then math would not be, according to, say, Pythagoras, as he mentioned, some kind of mystical insider backdoor to reality. It would be a way to kind of by tautology, using abstractions to make certain calculations, and then should those calculations be applied to our content that we parse up according to our will. Again, what is a day? What is a page? What is a mile? What is a meter? What is a second? What is a yard? This and that. Then it can be used to very nicely predict and describe experience.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, that's
Did you want
to go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So the second point then would be to first of all understand that we can never, obviously, by using math, understand what is reality fundamentally, right? How, according to the just mentioned conceptions, what does that even mean? I'm going to think more about it's nonsensical. It's a language to describe some of our experiences. But the second point would be that there is no way to understand the philosophical relations, the fundamental relations of which reality may consist by simply taking a closer and closer look at sense-connected content. For example, somebody writes me a letter, right, and it says, "Hey, how are you doing?" And let's say that I suppose that the way to understand this letter is to put it under a microscope. Right, so I look at it closer. Unless it's like a prank and it's written in tiny letters, then the microscope would help me. It's normal letters. I look at it closer. Well, I see some kind of other image. I need a more powerful microscope, an electron microscope. I look at it even closer still. It doesn't make any sense. It's just an image. I do a chemical test on it. It doesn't make any sense. I look at it through a telescope from a couple miles away. Maybe I still don't understand. What do I need to do? I need to read it using my reasoning. I need to try to grasp it and understand it. So just so with anything else, right? Again, in the naive kind of conception stemming from the childhood of humanity, objects are the fundamental reality. Some or another made up abstraction that can be referred to with the term matter is the underlying substratum of anything and everything. And by simply taking a closer look at it, or by manipulating some of those numerical descriptions of that content, we can understand, oh, it's the atoms, and no, maybe it's the quantum, the schmantum, the this and the that. If we look at it through this lens, we see there is no amount of looking closer at something with our senses that can give us real insight into what it is, and there's no amount of describing it mathematically or deriving any kinds of inductions or further sorts of suppositions from those formulas that can ever give us the slightest insight as to what anything is. And what would then give us that insight? It would be, say, something that can be called proper philosophical reasoning, proper thought, proper employment of the intellect to try to grasp the nature of things, the nature of reality best as we can. And we see that contrary to the insults of some scientists, oh, philosophy makes no progress. It's just everybody has their own little opinion. Philosophy certainly makes tremendous progress if we know where to look and what to study, and worldviews that can help us gain clarity and insight onto the nature of things and of ourselves, or if not plenty, or sufficient. And that would then be the way to do it, as opposed to some of the aforementioned ways.
Yeah, for sure. That's yeah, definitely, the mathematics, I mean, its principles are based on philosophical principles. but of course it cannot, and we could pass right into scientism. It cannot give us value, essentially, right? It values it is a useful thing, and it is it, that's interesting because Pythagoras would say that yes, it spiritualizes us, like it is for a spiritual life, but really you don't see that. Math is more, yes, it's good for the sake of knowing. That's a classical view of it, but really deep down, um, it is based on, as you said, it is based on knowledge of the individual. So because we have things that are one, what is a one? What does it mean one? One is a whole made up of parts, and the parts contribute for the good of the whole. A whole is not a part. You can have one part, but that's different from one whole, right? So the individuals have certain wholeness to them as the basis of mathematics, and the axiom, which is the same in metaphysics, is the principle of identity, which is A equals A. If A is A is not anything else. Right? So, and so by composition, as you're saying, we ultimately have mathematics and we're able to quantify, yes. So, but yeah, there is something lacking here. There is something lacking, as you're saying, that scientism, or I don't know if there's even term, mathematicalism, which is, we could say the same thing as
Good
scientism,
name.
is is essentially affirming something that's metaphysical. So it's funny. I was talking to one of my students who is very much into scientism, and he's saying that this is the only way we can know. Scientism basically is that we only know the world through science. That really only science gives us the truth, right? Whether that be experimental or mathematical, but something that is that is reasoned, um, but really it is based on the senses ultimately. So yeah, that's reasoned, and causes and effects, right? Relationship between cause and effect. So with principles, of course. So this is the only way we can know reality, science, the ultimate source of knowledge. So I told them, I was like, what that claim you're making is a universal claim, right? That claim, like science does not justify itself. That claim you're saying is a metaphysical claim, right? That claim you're saying is not provable by science or mathematics, right? So really, you're philosophizing in order to deny philosophy, essentially, as Aristotle would say, those who deny philosophy need to use philosophy to deny it. So you're ultimately, you cannot have a universal worldview that essentially denies the universal, right? The metaphysics is universals ultimately. So you cannot, and
Everything I say is a lie, right? There's no such
everything I
thing
say
as
is a lie,
truth.
right?
Well,
There are
is
no
that true?
absolutes. Yeah, there are no absolutes, right? This is like, wait a minute,
Is that an absolute?
is that an absolute? So there is an inherent contradiction with mathematicalism, which I think I made that word up, and scientism,
Good word.
essentially, right, inherent contradiction where they claim metaphysically that scientism or mathematicalism is universally true, while denying metaphysics is universally the only truth, the only way we can know reality, while denying metaphysics, even though, so they're essentially affirming the very thing they're denying.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point too. I think it could be worthwhile to psychologize this phenomenon a little bit, which is
Yeah,
not to
sure.
say that by that method it can be undermined. Right? I just expose you to psychoanalysis, quote unquote, and your arguments are debunked. You're saying that because of your childhood trauma. It's not so simple, but a little bit, I think it could help us gain some insight on this phenomenon. We say, going back to ancient times, this desire to put everything on quote unquote matter. Democritus, before him Lysippus, Epicurus. The motivations for Epicurus, for example, say it himself. I don't want to have fear. I don't want to worry about any wider ethical implications necessarily that might reach out beyond the narrow confines of the terrestrial, and therefore everything can be reduced to and derived from atoms, Right? The atoms are moving around, motion in the void, atoms in the void. They swirl a little bit to give us free will so that it doesn't spoil the party. But other than that, it's just all atoms, so there's no need to worry. So in contemporary times, I think we would do well to distinguish those individuals that out of a truth-loving self, out of a genuine desire to attain to reality, take the path of, say, empiricism, right? And as opposed to those who, out of a very strong desire to avoid facing oneself, to avoid the universal guilt of a burdened conscience that we all have, would have it that all of reality, presumably including persons, can be reduced to some of these ultimately vacuous terms that are in vogue in any given milieu. The logical positivists, for example, of the past century was a prominent such movement. There is no such thing, thousands of years worth of fine, say, philosophy, theology, psychology, all of that is complete nonsense. It's not even wrong. It's just empty verbiage. The only thing that exists are scientific statements, such as that atoms exist, right, and math. Right? Hume said something like, if it doesn't contain numbers, and if it's not a tautology, or maybe something along those lines, can throw it to the flames. It means nothing. So we would do well to distinguish those two kinds of approaches. There's somebody like William Whewell, for example, the scientist who invented the word science, certainly a very fine, truth-loving individual who used kind of the contemporary methods at his disposal to plod down the path of truth, right, and reality. And then there are individuals that simply cling to these terms, ultimately in desperation, so as to justify ourselves the way that we are, right? Again, put concretely, I know for a fact I'm nothing but a bunch of atoms, right? The atoms make up my neurons, and the neurons make up me, and therefore don't ask anything of me, right? I can do as I please without guilt, without shame. I still have all of my vanity and all of my desires without any of the consequences. There are no ethical obligations that apply to me. Right? So I think that is the kind of a covert motivation behind what you term, and we can term scientism, or as you made up the word, the metacism, whatever it might be. It's very convenient, which is not to say that it's not true. We said that, but it is worthwhile to remember, and it could help us understand why it is not so easy to suggest to somebody that is deeply sunk into this ideology that perhaps there are some issues with it. It is not simply, generally speaking, an impersonal attitude or approach.
No, for sure. There's tremendous consequences with this. So to identify all knowledge as scientific, and this is interesting because you see this today. Only if it's science, then it's true, right? If it's everything else, it's kind of just opinion based. No. So that reduction brings about a reductionism in other realms for sure, especially in morality. I mean, you really can't have morality, and this goes to the discussion before we were having. Science cannot establish morality. Science must be subject to morality, right? It has to be, or science, um, and this is interesting. This is kind of the pushback of the postmoderns with the school of Frankfurt, which are near Marxist, and they go off the other extreme. But they accuse scientism of really, which is rationalist ultimately, of causing all these atrocities, right? Not considering man in dignity, not considering. Well, maybe I'm giving them too much credit the way I'm describing them, but this is essentially a criticism, right? I'm giving them more, the postmoderns more kind of I'm making their position look a little better, but they essentially say that that scientism has created atrocities, right? Look at the two world wars, right? That is attributed to the scientific mindset, which flourished in the 18th and 20th century, flourished as fruit from the Enlightenment, right? And you have wars fought for, right? The Enlightenment principle, the French Revolution, The American Revolution, that's something, apples and oranges, of course. Um, but again, this kind of this absolutization of science, which brings men down, and really you don't have a morality where the ends, you don't have a, or you can't establish a morality, so you ultimately believe that the ends justify the means. So really, um, science cannot confer value on man, and hence there cannot be a morality established. And I think this is a fair criticism of the postmodernists. Is interesting. I took a class of postmodernism. This when I was for my bachelor's, and I didn't know what postmodernism was. So, but I was definitely, you know, as a Catholic, I'm against scientism, rationalism. So the professor, he was totally against scientism, totally against rationalism, against right many of the ideals of the Enlightenment. And I was thinking, wow, liberalism, this extreme subjectivism, individualism, extreme individualism. And I was thinking, wow, this is really incredible. I agree with him. But he was coming at it from an angle, from a postmodernist angle, which I thought was fascinating because he believed the opposite. And this is not the Catholic position. That's why I tell my students, and in the secular university too, it is only Catholicism that puts science in its rightful place. Everything, I mean, you in the secular world, science is absolutized because we're man. We have a thirst for the divine. We need something that transcends us. We need the supernatural. So if we don't have the supernatural where it actually is in the true relation of God, then really we're going to supernaturalize science, right? We're going to be, it's a tremendous temptation, scientism. So the postmodernists, they just become nihilists because, so you are seeing postmodernists now going back to faith. And we could probably pick this up with the next video, turning towards religion. But postmodernists now, there's a postmodernism trend in Catholicism. They want an irrational faith. They want a faith devoid of science. Science has gotten such a bad name. It's become so ugly that that they try to suscitate faith apart from science, which also falls into superstition. We do need science. The science is true and it's good in its rightful place, not absolutized. So I know I said a lot of
Yeah,
things there, but I don't know if you want to comment on that one.
no, I think that's a good way to put it, Professor. That reminds one of the claim that science can say what is, but it cannot say what ought to be. Right? That would be a job relegated to philosophy, to psychology. But again, it depends what we mean by the term science. By the term science, we can mean any impartial, disinterested approach to the pursuit of any sort of truth. Therefore, there can be a scientific approach to what is conventionally called philosophy or theology or psychology or anything at all, versus any kind of approach which tends to simply ingrain our subjectivity, ingrain our self-serving, skewed intellect, can be called anti-science. It doesn't matter what the particular content is. It is possible to, with humility and with sound character, try to understand the relations that inhere between content that arises in connection with the senses, and therefore build things such as was mentioned, bridges, as the amazing technology that we have, build cell phones, right?
Yeah, if I could just comment on
Maxwell.
something you said. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
if I could just comment on something you said, because I think it is pretty well established, the definition of science in general, because I think that's too broad to say that it's any type of knowledge. Because, like, for example, I know this is falling, but that's not science. If I say the marker is falling, right, that's not scientific knowledge. So that would
Yeah.
be, once you start asking the whys, right, the WHY, the causes and effects, the causes of the effects, then you're getting to the scientific realm, which is deeper. So I don't know if it's that you can subjectivize it that and manipulate it that to say just individual things of knowledge. Like, I know this to be a marker. If that's, I don't know if that's what you were saying, or what you want to.
I mean a little bit more that we can mean by science a particular attitude or approach to the pursuit of truth. I want to find out um, the reality concerning something. Again, it can be a societal phenomenon. How many people are uh, suffering from this issue or enjoying this good? Something like this. It could be a psychological phenomenon. What would be the explanation for the rise in some issue or other? It could be a philosophical question. And if I approach it with a particular attitude where I am willing to nullify myself and my self interest and my self will, we could use the term science to describe it. We don't have to. It's just a term. We can use any term we want. We can use the term honesty to describe it. But I think that would be an ennobled view of the scientific enterprise. On the flip side, if I am seeking self and self interest via whatever means, we would, according to that ennobled conception of the term science, say that that is not science. So, for example, when a researcher thinks, I want grant money no matter what, so I'm going to do the study, I'm going to throw out the inconvenient results, I'm going to skew things a little bit, I'm going to lie a little bit as needed, and here's science. We would say, no, that's not science. That's your own nonsense. So, again, that's simply a more dignified kind of conception of the scientific endeavor. Right. But I would say even then it can still be useful to distinguish between, or if we want to, we can distinguish between a consideration of the phenomenal world, I mean, sense-connected content, and how it relates to each other, and questions such as concern human beings' inner life or ethical dilemmas. Right? We can certainly make those distinctions.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, excuse me. Definitely science can be manipulated. There's an interesting book that talks about science being politicized and corrupted. And that's because I think you were alluding to that. I believe if I understood you right, you were saying that really any type of objective knowledge is scientific knowledge. But at the same time, there is basic knowledge. Like if I tell you the car is in the garage, that's not a
So
science. The science is classically too, it is an actual knowledge that is an explanation, as you said, an explanation of something, which would be the cause of something, not just individual uh, thing that's based on the senses. That where I'm just passively receiving sensory data, which is
I
true.
would distinguish, right, the attitude, not just knowledge, but the attitude towards knowledge.
Right, exactly, exactly. So some type of proaction you need in science, where you need to go and to delve a little bit of work.
But beyond that, right, I would say, that the number one thing is if I'm willing to set aside my self interest and pursue the truth for the sake of truth, or at most with the supposition that we allow for that our good is synonymous with our truth. Perhaps that would be a tenet
It's
of faith. But aside from that, and any such approach, we can call a pure approach, a good approach, a scientific approach to take a positive view of science. And any approach that is interested in simply aggrandizing oneself, right? That would be a non-scientific or dishonest or impure approach.
Well, you know what? A lot of these scientists are philosophical agnostics, epistemological agnostics. They don't believe, and this is absurd. They're not metaphysical realists, and heck, they're not even idealists. They don't even believe. So basically, metaphysical realism. Let's say some principles. Reality exists. I can know it. I can communicate it. If you don't, there's some scientists and the people I know believe this, who are educators, who PhDs, right, department chairs in college, who don't believe in the principle of non-contradiction, who don't believe that we can truly, they're very Kantian, we only know phenomena. So really, they by default, in a sense, they would have to, as a consequence, rather, they would have to believe as science as something manipulative. And then that's really crazy. And that's what postmodernists, they interpret science as just a power structure, where science does not convey true because everything is just subjective. Science is just an imposition of power of the past, right? Which is a crazy view. So it's, you if you deny the fundamental realities that underpin science and you try to do science as a scientist, you're going to manipulate it. And we're seeing this today. I mean, look at the science, quote unquote science, for all this, the existence of other genders. How That's not scientific. That is anti-science. So there's an equation, there's an identification between science and anti-science, precisely because now it has, and the postmodernists are right, because of this extreme subjectivization, extreme individualization, denial of metaphysical realism. That's not what they say, but they're right in their conclusion that it's really a power. It has become something of a power. The powerful dictate what is truth, as opposed to letting reality dictate the principles. The powerful, their principles, they're dictating reality.
Yeah.
I know
I
we're
think
going
as
off a
you,
little bit on into both, but it's
no,
really
no problem.
it's really interesting in that sense. I'm thinking of a doctor named Joseph Money. I don't know if you ever heard of '60s doctor, and he wrote all this works about how really male and female is a social construct, and you are is more of a nurture than nature question. So he wrote books on that, but his books, his science, he has all this data that supports his view, but he went purposefully to perverted people, like his right, the his what do you say that, it's not, I don't say specimens, but the ones he polled, right, in his studies, he went to people who were essentially perverted, like he looked for his data to be skewed. It's really sad. I don't know if you know the famous story of this woman who had twins, and they messed up the circumcision on one of the twins. And this woman, blue collar woman, both parents blue collar, ignorant. Not to say all blue collars are ignorant, not by any means, but in this case, yes,
I got a blue
they
collar right
trusted the
here,
doctor.
man.
They trusted they trusted the doctor, and the doctor said, "Well, just raise him as a girl and just have the sex reassignment surgery, because you can." He or she would just be a girl. It's just according to, it's societal, according to how you parent the child. And this person, I don't know, it's a famous case. This person grew up always feeling like a boy, but they were told they were a girl, they're dressed like a girl, they had the body parts, even though they were, right, surgically done, artificially done, of a girl. And finally, because that person became suicidal, the parents revealed, 14 years old, not because the person became suicidal, but because they had all this, right, all the depression and all these things. They revealed, and this person tried to retransition back to what he was born as a male, but he ultimately committed suicide. Yeah, even though he retransitioned, he actually got married, but the damage was done in him. That it was, so really, this is an example of what you're saying. I mean, these are scientists that manipulate data for their own benefit. So instead of using reality to dictate their principles are shifting reality. And the philosophy or anti-philosophy of today, uh, it is giving the underpinnings for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in these kinds of connections, all kinds of things could be referenced. We could say somebody like Kant making the distinction between phenomenal reality and the quote unquote thing in itself opens the door to saying that, we can never know what is the thing itself, and we can manipulate things as we please. And then that could be credited to any kind of influence that we want. We could say something like nominalism. There's no universals. There's particular things. There's no actual um, you know, abstracted or universal species or categories or classes. But ultimately, I think the bottom practical point would be that nothing can replace character and its development. Nothing can replace humanity and its development. We have to acknowledge our insufficiency. We have to acknowledge our deviancy. or degeneracy from an ethical point of view, right? And then we have to strive toward being the kinds of individuals that want to be honest, that want to be true, that want to love something over and above ourselves. And in that pursuit, whatever it is in particular that it applies to, be it the work of a chemist, be it the work of a bricklayer, be it the work of an astronomer, a physicist, a philosopher, a teacher, a student, whoever it might be, then we will realize our fullest potentialities and attain to our highest good. While we have no such interest, while my only interest is to simply aggrandize again my pride, right? Stoke the flames of my vanity, confirm my own self-serving views, then we can call it science, we can call it schmience, we can call it philosophy, schmilosophy. It really doesn't matter. It's
That's
just
right.
our own nonsense, our own kind of stuff, and it helps nobody.
That's right.
Aside from maybe learning to not be like that, by negative example.
That's a really good way to end it now. Really, the truth has to be the basis, which is a conformity, adequatio, and a conformity with the subject and the object. With the object, the metaphysical reality being metaphysical truth, being the basis of logical scientific truth. So you said it. I mean, truth is the basis. You can't have ethics. You cannot have a value system without the affirmation of truth. You can't have science. So it's really, it's really good summing up you did right there. So we're going to end it now. We are at an hour. So we will continue this. We'll get into more of how scientism relates with religion. And yeah, it was great. I did forget to mention at the beginning, subscribe, click on the like button, all that good stuff. Share this video, leave a comment, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And thank you to you, Jeremy. We'll see you.